Welcome to episode 168 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. This is John Denning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
Yeah. Again, it's been a while since you've said sunny Napa, rainy Napa, wonderful Napa. How are things up there?
They're always good, man. It's been winter, and winter is now ending, so get those half seasons. Cold in the morning, very warm in the afternoon. So if anyone's thinking about visiting wine country, now's a great time to do it.
Well, I'll see you in about 5 days then. That's actually true. I'm
that is true.
On Sunday. So that leads me to the most important question, probably the whole episode, which is, if it's pool weather, what are you drinking?
It's not pool weather yet. Oh. Remember, it takes a while to heat up a large body of water like that.
Everything's pool weather if you're brave enough.
Yeah, well, I've done a polar plunge. I've actually gone off the slide into the pool in 40-degree temperatures. Let me tell you something. That was a shock to the system. Won't be doing that again.
My kidneys are going to shut down regardless. I don't think I should take these chances.
Yeah, thank God there was a hot tub churning nearby and I was able to recover. But the dog jumped in with me and I could see the look of fear and confusion on the dog's face.
I'm sure she loved it.
She did not. She did not at all.
You say that, and yet I bet you are drinking something semi-tropical.
Yes, I am. I'm drinking a rum flip, and that is because we're going to talk about the U.S. News Law School rankings, and last year I had a vodka flipped as a kind of a nod to the churn in the rankings. So this year I was like, I like that drink, and I've kind of really taken to flips recently, which usually involve like eggs or eggs whites, and so I went for the rum flip this time.
Well, there you go. I have no idea what that is, what's in it, aside from rum.
It's rum, cream, sugar. Basically, you throw an egg in there and you shake the hell out of it, and it gets kind of like a creamy top on it.
You almost lost me at rum. The rest of that, garbage.
Sorry.
It's all right. I don't know if I'll please you. I'm slowly getting back into the swing of things. For those who listened to our April recap last week, they may recall with some horror that I was not drinking at all because I had a lady friend in town to visit me. She left a bunch of good bottles of wine, one of which I opened specifically for this, Dave, which is an Albarino. I don't know if it's Portuguese or Spanish. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right, if you want to know the truth. But that's what I've got. It's an Albarino. Don't ask me the brand. I just poured and wandered.
Yeah. It's a great varietal they have all through the Mediterranean. So you see it in like Italy, Portugal, Spain.
Yeah,
there's even some
it's a crispy white.
Yeah, there's some made in California as well. I mean, California can make anything because we can grow anything out here.
There you go. Speaking of crispy whites, tell me the song you chose.
I didn't really choose it. It's the same song we've used for 3 years running for this, maybe 4.
Crispy White seemed like a good intro to David Bowie.
Well, I don't know if he's crispy at this point.
Well, he's probably more soggy at this point.
Well, I don't talk about David Bowie that way. Coolest dude ever.
He was pretty great.
You're a Steve McQueen guy, but I think David Bowie was one of the coolest humans ever.
Ride and die with Steve.
Yeah, since it's the rankings, we had to go with Changes by David Bowie. And honestly, until time ends and we do this podcast, we will be using that for this particular episode.
There you go.
It is.
Yeah, if we're doing this a year from now, expect more David Bowie.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
And another flip of some sort, although rum and vodka, I'm running out of the white
tequila flip
pretty quick.
I bet tequila flip would work.
I will not drink tequila any longer.
That's a conversation for you, me, and your therapist later.
You don't remember this, but when I lived in Los Angeles a long time ago, me and essentially my roommates had a wall of empty tequila bottles.
Cool.
We'd crush them and then just add it to the wall and slowly, we covered up an entire wall of the apartment. And I think maybe that did something to me.
Psychologically?
I don't like it anymore. No more tequila, please.
Tell me how tequila hurts you.
Yeah, I know
doll,
you still
Dave,
like tequila. Yeah, if tequila comes around, I'll hand it to you because I know you are a tequila fan.
Love tequila.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. All right, there you go. Next year, if either of us are still alive, tequila flip.
There you go.
We'll get Dave back in the saddle. Let's talk a little bit about the LSAT world. And I think the first thing to mention, actually, topically, is that tonight, not when we're recording this, but when this releases, April 22nd, midnight Eastern, is the cutoff to register for the June LSAT. So if you want to take the June test and you aren't signed up yet, when you hear this, assuming you hear it on the release day of this, you've got until tonight to do it. Go ahead and get signed up. And here's part of the great news there. Again, I'm stretching a little bit for LSAC's sake, but they have extended the refund cutoff for June until the day after the April LSAT that we just went through, those scores release. Those scores are going to come out on April 30th. The June refund cutoff, at least, is May 1st, so the day after. So you can sign up for June at this point, really with no penalty, assuming you're reasonably well attuned to like a calendar and a watch. Fair?
Yes, and it is fair, and we've talked about why don't they just make the regular
I
cutoff?
know. Yeah, you and I actually kind of bemoaned this for a while.
I complained this about last week. I feel like I'm almost like mumbling my way through my like objecting. I'd already talked about it.
At some point, what can you do but just sort of grumble the same things? But that's just getting old. Let's talk a little bit about some of the seminars, the webinars we have there's one in particular I know that you and I definitely want to focus on, but we do have a number, especially if you're taking this June test. Let me focus on the ones that exist prior to that. So the June test starts early June, but we've got a couple of webinars. They're always free in April and in May. The next one that we have coming up is on April 29th. That is the LSAT 101. So if you're brand new to this thing and just want to know a little bit more about the test itself, that's a good one. Scores are going to come out for the April test the next morning. The June cutoff for getting your money back is the next day. So a busy week next week. That's a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, if you're tracking it that way. What I think you and I are paying particular attention to, Dave, is an update to our most recent crystal ball. We did one for the April and June test based on how April went, which, spoiler, we talked about last episode, and went very well, at least for us, hopefully for people. We're doing an update specifically for June called the Crystal Mini Ball. That's going to be on May 6th. And that's going to focus entirely just on that June test based on what we saw happen in April. And there are a couple of more. On May 13th, we're doing a reading comprehension skills test webinar. I say we, PowerScore and Barbie are hosting one. You and I won't be a part of this one, although it's one of our favorite ones I think that we ever designed together. And finally, at the very end of May, May 28th, we're doing one on common flaws in logical reasoning. To me, that might be the most, if you're talking like points for time as a ratio, common flaws is huge.
Yeah, it's one of those things you just have to know because you need to be able to spot it quickly. If it's there, you want to be able to spot it in the argument. And if it's not, you want to be able to eliminate it when they describe it in the answer choices. Exactly so right. You get a twofold benefit there.
Yeah, well said. Perfect. Okay, so that's what's coming up in the LSAT world. Again, we hope you guys get a chance to attend one or more of those webinars. If I had to pick one for you, it would be the Crystal Mini Ball on May 6th.
But why pick just one?
But why pick just one? Exactly. I feel that way, Dave, about
I'll put on my
a
radio
rum flip. Why
voice.
have just one?
But wait, there's more.
Wait. Well,
yes,
in this
case,
podcast, there is more. Go ahead.
There is more. Now we get to talk about the new rankings, which are essentially the 2025 rankings in terms of when they're coming out. They keep changing the name on this. Sometimes they use a single year. Sometimes they do 2024-2025, that kind of thing. I really hate that. It came out in 2025. Let's just call it 2025. Last year was 2024-2025, and now they've changed it to just this year. And as always, you know, this comes out and it's kind of like there's a bubble of attention around it for a week or so. And in this case, it came out over a week ago. It came out before the LSAT, but I was gone and I think you were doing other things as well. We were getting ready for the test. Normally, we cover this almost immediately upon it coming out. I got asked by a few media outlets about it, and so I responded to those, but we've pushed it down here, and now we'll just kind of cover it because I think at least it's good to track what they're doing and to really put a spotlight on who U.S. News is, how they actually put this together, and why these rankings are so important and what happens from year to year. Because without tracking what happens from year to year, you don't really get a lens into whether these are really useful or not. So U.S. News, if you're not familiar, used to be a big paper magazine called U.S. News and World Report. And they got into this whole thing where they started ranking everything. And it turned out, surprise, surprise, that their collegiate rankings were very popular. People started deferring to them. And of course, they added all the graduate schools. And in law schools now for the past 30 plus years, the U.S. News rankings have been kind of like the standard, you know, definition of what a good, great law school is supposed to be. And so the first thing to really kind of examine in terms of what they do is to realize that they are a profit-making operation. They don't do this out of the goodness of their hearts. It's not a charity. They are there to make money. And one of the things they need to make money is they need the rankings to move a little bit every year.
Right.
If they were exactly the same from year to year, it's like, well, why buy the magazine or in this case, the subscription to the online information, which is what they want you to buy.
Yeah. Why click?
Yeah, why click on it? So it always changes a little bit, surprise, surprise. And I've commented on this many times over the years about how it's essentially an arbitrary thing. They make up the methodology. You could make a different methodology and release your own rankings, John. I could do the same thing. It depends on what I prioritize. And so you look at the way things are prioritized and compare it to, say, 10 years ago to now, it's very different, even 3 years ago to now. So let's just look at a brief overview of the prioritization. 58% of the rankings, kind of number for each school is made up of placement in terms of jobs,
Right.
employment outcomes, bar passages, and so forth. Another 25% is what they call quality, which is really just reputation. It's a peer assessment of other law schools, as well as the assessment of lawyers and judges. 10% more is about what they call selectivity, which is really a funny word for it because it's 5% LSAT and GRE, 4% GPA, and 1% acceptance rate. Selectivity is kind of about acceptance rate, but that's the smallest one of these there.
10% of 10%.
And then finally, faculty and library resources. So, kind of like the guts of any kind of law school is 7%. Interestingly, John, for the last 2 years, the actual numbers have remained the same, the percentages for each. So you might say, oh, they change because the schools change. No, they do some things differently every time. This year, it looks like they have kind of prioritized employment outcomes at the 10-month point, which is about 33% or 1/3 of the rankings number that they produce, to weight certain jobs as more valuable, such as a federal clerkship, which does make sense. That's going to be, those are the most desired jobs. They should actually probably have a greater weight. But they don't, at least I have not seen them talk about the weights that they give to that, so I can't tell what the further weights are inside of it. But it's really been consistent for a while. And there's two things that I'll point out is that a couple years ago, they dropped the LSAT/GRE, but really for our purposes, LSAT, since not too many people use the GRE, from about 11.25% down to 5%.
Yeah.
So the LSAT is actually a really small part of this now. And when they did that, they bumped up the placement rate, the employment outcome. It used to be actually just 26%. And now, as I said before, it's 58%. So they kind of really did a radical overhaul a few years ago and said, we need to look at outcomes as opposed to what LSAT and acceptance rate, which are inputs.
Yeah. Can I make a quick clarifying point here that maybe it doesn't need making. Maybe no one's confused about this or needs the clarification, but this is how U.S. News ranks schools. This is not how schools choose to accept applicants. So when we say that LSAT only counts for 5%, we're saying that based on the acceptances from schools and their LSAT numbers in terms of how U.S. News then begins to treat them in the grand scheme of things. LSAT is still easily the most important factor when it comes to getting into the schools that we're going to talk about here or when you're thinking about them. So I don't want to make that very clear, again, distinction.
No, it's a reasonable point because you might think, well, it's only 5%. Why do they care? Because it's one of the inputs they control.
Right. Or you might think it's
about
only 5%. Why am I investing so much time in this number when what I should be focused on is the job I could get later on? Yeah. That's not what this is. That's not what we're talking about.
Schools that are interested in increasing their rankings have the opportunity to say, well, if I can increase my LSAT, maybe it'll help me out. Years ago, it would have had a bigger impact. Right. Now it has a smaller impact, but still the human condition says, well, if I can control it, I should make it better.
Right.
Same thing with your student-faculty ratio, which is 5% of this, or your library resources, which are 2%. These are all inputs that they can control. Why accept somebody at 150 when you could accept somebody at 170, and in the long run, that might raise your average to a point where it might move you up the rankings. These days, LSAT scores are so high that I kind of feel like, look, everybody's got a high LSAT score. It's not having a huge impact, but at the same time, we can't tell how they're differentiating inside that 5%. What's the difference between a 169 and a 170 median? Is it significantly different than 168 to 170, or are they very similar? We can't see how that 5% is actually being manipulated inside.
Yeah.
But that is actually how it is broken down. And of course, one of the things that's happened is it means that outcomes like bar passage have become a lot more important. First time bar passage is now almost 1/5 of the kind of like the number that a school will ultimately produce.
Yeah, 18%.
Yeah, I expect over time, ultimate bar passage is 7%. So about 25% of this is now bar passage. And you would expect that schools will start focusing on making sure that students can pass the bar, which, as we all know, is very important because if you can't pass the bar, you can't practice. So maybe we should focus on that.
Yeah.
In any event.
It's very strange how the numbers when they come to evaluate schools are so different from what the schools seem to care about when they evaluate candidates.
Yeah. The thing is, every year U.S. News makes mistakes. They always release some kind of preliminary version of the schools that has a bunch of errors in it. They did it last year. I think they did it this year again. It's almost like a comedy show where it's like, hi, we don't really know what we're doing and we might change our mind, but here's what we're thinking right now. Then they gauge the response. And maybe that's not what happens, but it feels like it to me. And then they go back and then later on, new rankings come out. And they always put in a big embargo where they're like, they send to all the schools the rankings, but then they say you can't talk about it. Well, inevitably, this all gets leaked. I had the T14 in my hands a week before they were released to the public, and it's like they don't want you to talk about it. They'll send angry letters about it, which, well, don't release it to almost 200 schools beforehand if you don't want it released. Like, how stupid is that? People will talk.
So as we get into this, then I think one of the key things to put up front before we even start talking school names or placements and movements and winners and losers and things we're going to do, let's talk a little bit about just the stock that you should put in these rankings themselves. One of our most popular blog posts of all time, Dave, as you know, because you wrote it and you have been very diligent about responding to comments, was this post about prestige versus finance, essentially. I'm summarizing a lot there. But do you go with the school that has the higher ranking or has the more historically, again, kind of prestigious name attached to it? Or do you save your money and go someplace that's maybe lower ranked, but isn't going to break the bank for the rest of your mid-30s and 40s?
Yeah, the classic question, scholarship versus prestige is the name of that blog. And I actually didn't write it, but I answer all the questions on it.
Oh, so you just
kind of
jumped
fell
in like a
to
benefactor at the end. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought that was
Isn't that
yours
nice?
that you wrote too.
I think I've modified it. I probably should go in and modify it again. But what it really talks about is, especially for people who are choosing schools, and we're seeing that right this minute, is, all right, if I've got an offer from NYU, but I get no money, I have to pay full ride, is that a better choice for me? Or should I take Vanderbilt with 75% of it paid for, and I only have to pay for 25% of it? What's the better choice there? In my case, I'd probably say Vanderbilt, by the way.
Yeah.
But these are the kind of things that people get into, and they'll be like, all right, I got Boston College at 100% or Northwestern where I have to pay everything. And the prestige of Northwestern, T14 kind of thing, makes people stop and have to kind of go through it. So that's what that blog is about. But a lot of it comes back to these rankings, because people will be like, all right, this school is ranked 35th, and this is what I got for money there versus this school who's ranked 12th, and this is money I didn't get there. And so I've, over the years, provided advisement on like how to frame that discussion. And, a lot of it has to do with your goals, your financial situation, what the exact offers are, cost of living in these areas. Because, Chicago is way more expensive to live in than maybe another school that's a little bit more away from a metropolitan area.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just trying to live in the seas for a second. But yeah, I mean, these are all... And one of the things I've always said about these rankings, and I know you agree with this because we've done this more than once, that's why David Bowie keeps coming up, is part of the utility in this isn't so much where schools are ranked, but the nature of the data that goes into the ranking itself. Is because you can see how it is that they treat things like student-faculty ratio. That to me matters. How it is that they treat things like bar passage rate or employment outcomes. That to me matters. The name of the school and the number next to it is, to me, far less important than some of the criteria that were involved in putting the school where it is. And it doesn't always translate. It doesn't always correlate.
No, it doesn't. And one of the things I've often said is that to me, the most important thing is the employment outcome.
Yeah.
Will you get a job if you spend money? And it's time to kind of go through this. And so one of the things that happens is because of that, people see these rankings and they're like, look, 1 is better than 3 for sure.
Right.
I'm like, it doesn't work that way. The first thing is that the numbers, you're ranked 1st and 10th. That feels like these are 2 very different teams or schools, rather. I'm thinking sports all of a sudden.
I know exactly what you're doing. And mostly because Duke had a banner year in rankings here, so I know what's on your mind, Dave.
We're not talking about Duke.
I know it all. That's on your mind.
I'm not talking about them for 6 months. I don't even want to hear the name for a while. I'm pissed.
I'm going to keep going.
At least as far as that goes, you take a look at the situation and it's like, it looks like there's a big difference, but there really isn't. The numbers are actually ridiculously small. And again, remember, the numbers that you're seeing are based upon what U.S. News has chosen arbitrarily. And so anything can really happen with this. And I think the sports thing comes in is because I've analogized this to the NCAA tournament. This was a strange year because 4 number 1 seeds got to the very end. That doesn't typically happen. And sometimes a 16 seed beats a number 1 seed. Remember that, Virginia?
Virginia.
And
Yeah.
so as you kind of go through these things, you've got to be careful in thinking that it is ironclad. It looks decisive, but it is anything but decisive. It is not ironclad in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
That said, it's still fun to talk about the numbers and the movements and, in my case, to mock U.S. News a little bit about it.
Yeah, I think so too. Obviously, mocking anything is fun. But I give an example. I've used this in past years, that a lot of what people should do with these rankings is not just take them with a grain of salt, but really kind of deconstruct them to a more granular sense of, here's what U.S. News weighed within these component pieces, and here's how I would weigh them instead. You talked before about the idea of people could come up with their own rankings themselves based on simply different scoring criteria or weighting criteria. If you want to put your thumb on the scales for a little bit and move things around, I think you should. One of my favorite examples is an old good girlfriend of mine went to the Charleston School of Law, not because it was a great school, not because she wasn't qualified to go to higher ranked schools. It's because she knew exactly the type of law that she wanted to practice, which in her case was historical preservation law.
Yeah.
Yeah, the kind of thing where you sue somebody if they don't put the right age windows on the front of their house on trad or whatever.
Talking about
That was a little close to home.
I didn't get sued
Literal
over it.
home?
And I did put the right windows on my house.
I know. And you lived on trad, so I used that very specifically.
Yes.
But you've been through that ridiculous series of loopholes, the gymnastic nature of what they make you do. But she wanted to practice historical conservation law, I think it's what it's actually called. And the College of Charleston, the School of Law at Charleston, whatever it's named now, that was a great place to do it. Could she have gone to better schools? Yes. But she stayed there for the specific reasons because they were very good at that. So I always look at these rankings through that kind of lens. What do you want to do? What matters most to you? What are the things you care about? Factor that in the way that U.S. News has as well, but maybe they've factored it in differently. Your rankings may be on a personal level entirely different.
Yeah, and there are sub-rankings for things like tax law.
Right.
And just to kind of put a bow on your comment about Charleston, for those who don't know, Charleston has a sizable historic district downtown. And they're always, whenever they're doing excavation, they have to be careful because they're going back hundreds of years, which in Europe is something you do every minute. But in the U.S., there's not too many cities like that. So Charleston has prioritized archaeological and historical preservation. And as John said, interestingly, I didn't get sued over this because I adhered to the law. But for example, if you want to change your windows in downtown Charleston, you cannot just go out and get the latest Anderson window walls and pop them in. That is forbidden. If you have if you live in the historic district, essentially, and I did,
we both did,
you have to get old original glass, which is usually about 100 years old, and the window frames have to be made by hand. It's incredibly annoying and even more expensive.
I was about to say, don't leave out expensive, Dave.
Yeah, let's not forget that. The first time I learned that one, I don't know if we had a broken window pane, and the dude came out, and I was like, yeah, whatever the latest is. And he's like, oh, no, you live downtown. You can't do that, son. We're going to have to actually make this. And they made it in my driveway. Literally carpenters out there putting it in, fitting it. I was like, this is the most ridiculous thing in the world.
That's brutal. One of the few broken things at your house I didn't have handed.
Yeah, that's right. You broke a lot of stuff at my house. I'm still mad about it.
Oh, broke your spirit. Anyway, should you put a lot of stock in these rankings? With a giant asterisk caveat on it. I think the rankings matter and people care about them. Obviously, we wouldn't be having this conversation, but I do think what's most valuable here is how the rankings are formulated, because component parts of the formula itself can be extremely revealing and can steer you in ways that you might be surprised to find.
Yeah, what I always say is I get why people use them. It's human nature. For me, if you're looking at these schools, if you truly have decided that 2 schools would completely suit your temperament, your criteria for where you want to live, the nature of the school, let it come down to how much it costs and the employment outcomes. Those are really the important thing. And don't just say, 93% are employed. Look at where they're employed. Look at the states that they're in. Look at the types of jobs they have. Go beyond the surface unemployment, because that is really what you'll be facing in 3 years when you're looking for a job. And some people are like, if I go to Harvard, my job is set. Go graduate in the bottom quarter of Harvard. It's a big law school class. It's hard. You're not looking at big law typically. Yeah. You're looking at a big bill, but not necessarily big law.
Yeah, Georgetown can do you more favors than Harvard can if you graduate in different places.
Yeah. I mean, some of these law schools are very small and some of them are very large. There's all sorts of little things that you have to look at. I mean, you have to evaluate it almost as if you're about to date somebody. What are the strengths and weaknesses? What do you really like? Some schools you're just like, I fell in love immediately and I loved it and everything just worked out perfectly. You're the lucky one. Some people have to go through a number of schools and really examine different ones before they find the one that they like the most. And again, if that doesn't work out, you can maybe transfer. Just don't count on being able to transfer because everything about transferring is your first year grades.
Yeah. Yeah. You want to be careful here before you commit. I saw a quote the other day. I don't think you'll like it. It was, marriage is basically buying someone you hate a house. And you don't like
It's
it.
ridiculous.
Well, marriage is buying a house for someone you hate. You'll like it better that way.
Why do you
Either
have
way.
to? The hell?
I thought it was great both ways. Regardless, this is a huge commitment. And so much of this really is data driven in ways that I don't think it's scientific enough about. I don't think people go on feel, people go on rankings when what they should be doing is really focus on these more subcutaneous factors.
Yeah, I don't even think I understand that example, so I'm not even going to address it. But I
you
will say
certainly understand the nature of commitment and how this is a big deal and going to cost you a lot of money if you make the wrong one. But
sure.
okay. So
But
my
why do you have
point,
to hate the person? That seems like
oh,
antithetical.
that was just
with what
me trying to be kind of dismissive of marriage.
failed.
Fair enough. Well, don't fail like me. Look at these schools a little more closely than just the number beside them. Look at these more intricate details of what contributed to that number, both in terms of how U.S. News quantifies those numbers and also how it is that you would quantify them yourself.
Yeah, I will say that the marriage part appeals to me in terms of talking about this
Oh, I know
because you're about to be married to the school. You will
Right.
go there for 3 years, and guess what? You're an alumni. It follows you thereafter. So make sure you're satisfied with the choice that you make. You don't want to get into a situation where you're like, I wish I hadn't. It's possible. Divorces are possible, like I said, transferring. But I always tell people who are like, I want to transfer after the first year, you better go to a school where even if you couldn't transfer, you're still satisfied with graduating. That said, John, let's look at the broad strokes of the movement in the top 50 here.
Fine. Let's talk about marriage. I'm kidding. Let's actually talk about
You and I have very opposed views on marriage, so I'm happy to debate that with you anytime you'd like.
Cool. I'll see you Sunday.
Yeah, you will.
It's a date. Pre-marriage.
It's not how I would term it, but whatever.
All right. You tend to break this down really well. You have a very analytical mind when it comes to movement and seeing the historical tendencies and trends. So I'm going to let you carry a lot of this conversation, much like I did for the April recap last week. Turnabout, fair play.
It's cool.
Cool. You want to start with the top 14?
Yeah, and let's talk about why we call it the top 14, because you'll see it everywhere. The T14, that's the top 14 schools. The T20, top 20 schools, T25, and so on. Traditionally, that T14 has referred to the same 14 schools who were for years and years, decades really, always the same top 14 schools in the U.S. News rankings. And it was always Yale at the top. Georgetown was usually at the very bottom, at bottom 14.
13, 14, 15, yeah.
Yeah, if you could be at the bottom of something like that. Although this year we have started to see some movement around. So let's just run through the T14 because honestly, everybody always talks about those schools. Just like last year, Stanford and Yale are tied for number one. Yale has always been number one in these rankings. So now they're tied, but they are still number one there. Chicago holds its position at number three. Like the reputation of Chicago, super, super high.
And well-deserved, frankly. I'm a big Chicago fan.
Yeah, great school, no doubt about it. UVA, another great school. Yep. They hold at number 4. So things at the top look pretty good. And now you start to see some movement here because with UVA at 4, and Stanford and Yale kind of like, the number 1, you end up with this kind of like multiple way tie at 4, which is really Duke and Harvard dropping a couple spots.
Yep. I think you've got that. Was Duke ever higher than 6?
Or no, they were 4. They were 4 last year.
Okay. So yeah, so now it's 5 and 6 are both kind of occupied by Harvard and Duke, but unspecified as to who's who.
No, they're actually tied for 6.
Right. So 5 and 6 because UVA is 4.
Yeah, I think in looking at that, and they dropped.
Right.
So now Harvard is 6th. And I think in one of the quotes that I made to one of the reporters I was talking to, it was just like, it used to be that it was Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, all the time as the top three. Now all of a sudden, those two are number one, and Harvard is 6. Just kind of just falling into obliteration.
Yeah, I mentioned it before. We've got a winners and losers segment of this that we always do. This is not the last time you guys are going to hear about Harvard. I bet you
No,
can
it is
guess which
not.
column.
Yes, you can imagine that. NYU and Michigan have climbed a spot up to, into a tie for 8th. Columbia
7, 8, yeah.
dropped 2, and Northwestern dropped 1 to tie at 10th. UCLA has moved up. They are now 12th. They were 13th last year, so now they are suddenly solidly in the top 14. And then at 14 itself, it's not 14. It's a 4-way tie there with Georgetown sticking in there as always. Texas and Washington University School of Law in St. Louis has jumped 2 positions, and Vanderbilt has jumped 5 positions. And those 4 schools are tied at the 14th spot.
Yeah, I think 13, lucky 13, is now Berkeley. So UCLA, this kind of California battle, and Berkeley have flipped. UCLA went from 13 to 12, and Berkeley occupied their wake. And then, this 14, 15, 16, 17 is those 4 schools you just mentioned. Good on Texas, by the way. I'm an Austin fan these days.
Yes, you are. I think I was covering the changes, but I think 5 and 13 remained exactly the same. Everything else moved around a little bit. Couple jumps.
No, I think 13 was UCLA and Berkeley swapping. 12 and 13. I think they flipped positions. Don't quote me on that. You can.
I won't. Yeah, because I think UCLA at 12 and then the 4-way tie at 14.
Yeah,
I'd have to go look at it. But literally, just tracking the changes there. I'm mostly interested in the movement around it because that, to me, I'm always thinking, what's U.S. News doing inside of that?
So the top 14 now is really the top 17.
Yeah, isn't that great?
How fun!
The thing is some of these schools will drop back down again next year. A 5 position jump inside the top 20 is actually really huge. Like statistically,
Vanderbilt in particular, man, that's crazy.
That's the one.
Yeah,
that's a really huge jump, and ultimately is one of those situations where you don't often see that. And so I imagine they may slide down next year, but I'm sure people in Nashville are quite thrilled, as they are in St. Louis, because now they've jumped in here. Georgetown just always 14, man, sometimes 13, but UCLA is now past everybody. But again, this is such a small change. Is there something about Vanderbilt that is just way better this year than last year? No. Law schools don't change that fast.
Yeah.
Yeah, there can have new people come in, changes can be made, things can get gussied up a little bit, but I just don't see it. And that's one of the reasons I criticize these.
Well, it's the first time in this conversation, too, we've actually made the point of pointing at a change in statistical outcome and been like, this is why you shouldn't take it too seriously.
Notice, though, you start to see there's a bunch of ties there.
Right.
2-way tie here, 2-way tie here, 2-way tie
Lots
here.
of
You have
them,
it at 6. You have it at 1, 6, 8, 10, and then a 4-way tie at 14. These schools, are they exactly identical, John? They are tied.
And did Vanderbilt really do something so significantly wonderful over the past calendar year that they are now 14th as opposed to whatever they were before, 19th?
19th. Take a look at the top 25. You see the same type of thing. Of course, it doesn't start at 15 anymore because, as you said, we've got a top 17. It starts at 18, and it's all ties. 2-way tie there at 18. Cornell goes up 4 or drops 4. Cornell is now 18th. It has dropped out of the top 14. There are 2 things that always jump out at me here. Harvard dropping to 6, Cornell dropping to 18, and Carolina suddenly, makes its way up, and now they're tied at 18 with Cornell. I'm sure they're thrilled over in Chapel Hill. When you go to 20, you've got a 2-way tie with Notre Dame kind of holding at 20, and Minnesota drops from 18 to 20. Minnesota has been solidly in the top 20 now for a while. Then you get to 22, and it's a 3-way tie. Like, literally, it's tie after tie after tie. You've got Boston University, Texas A&M, who's really been rising recently, and then UGA, your home school, John, drops down to.
Close. Athens, Augusta. But, yeah, it's interesting. There seems almost less volatility in the 14 to 25 range than there was in the 1 to 14.
Yeah. Well, they're moving, but they're all tying, which is ridiculous. And then the 25th spot is Boston College, who went up from 28 to 25, which seems statistically significant, but it really isn't. Just to me, I just see tie after tie after tie. I see these little incremental jumps, and that's actually a theme aside from Vanderbilt jumping 5. most of the jumps and drops this year were not as pronounced as they were last year. Last year, there was some insane movement. It is not as much this year. The last thing we'll just say is, when you get into the top 50, if you just look at the moves of 6 positions or more, because there's too many schools here to list out, these are the moves of 6 or more. USC went down 6 spots, and this is Southern Cal, not South Carolina.
They're falling apart.
Yeah, they went down 6 to 26. Seems like they're falling apart. No, they're not falling apart. They've been in this range from like 18 to 25 for a while.
Well, they were 10 higher a couple of years back.
Yeah, they've moved up and down, dude. This is what happens all the time. You start looking at the history of schools, you're like, oh wow, it's like a ping pong ball for some of the schools. Especially the further away from the T14 that you get, the more the movement just becomes crazy to look at. Wisconsin, the main flagship, Madison there, up 8 to number 28. GW up 10 spots to number 31. Florida State's been having a big rise. They're up to 38 now, up 10 spots. At the same time, just down the way in Florida, in Gainesville, Florida is down 10 spots to 38. We'll come back to those two, but maybe not. We'll just address it now. If you look at what's happened is in the last 2 years, FSU has risen 18 spots to get to 38. Florida has dropped 18 spots. So they were 20, now they're 38. Those two schools are tied. They're going in very different directions. And Florida, I know their dean left a couple of years ago. I'm wondering how much that's connected to this, Laura Rosenberry. She had driven them pretty high in the rankings, and now all of a sudden they are drifting down. So something to note.
She had them really high, like top 20, and now they're barely cracking top 40.
That's exactly what they were. They were right at that 2021 mark. ASU, who had risen up pretty high, now is kind of falling back down a little bit, down 9 to 45. And then Illinois, got a lot of Big Ten schools in here, down 12 to 48. And so you see like kind of this movement, but I want to note, even as we talk about it, wow, up 8, down 8, all this movement, you think these schools really got 10 spots better or 10 spots worse?
I'm glad you brought this up, because this is, I think, the point to really emphasize here. These schools haven't changed. It's not like you're going, oh man, I was going to go to Illinois, but now they're down 12 spots to number 48. I was going to go when they were 36 because they were clearly a better school than. They're the same school. This is entirely capricious and arbitrary.
Yeah, things do happen. Like I mentioned, the Dean of Florida leaving, and that can have an effect. But did it have an effect on the school's quality of teaching? No, but it may have had an effect on what the dean emphasized, which may very well have helped to drive the rankings up. So either way,
I think too, a lot of what the people emphasize at these schools is contingent upon how they know the rankings are formulated. So you lose somebody who's sort of a rankings fiend, and maybe you don't check the boxes quite as hard, quite as stridently. That doesn't make the nature of your school any better or worse. It just means you don't affect the rankings algorithm in the same way.
Well, the truth is that some schools pay a lot of attention to this and some don't. And you can get help. Spivey Consulting helps law schools with their...
We've seen it.
Kind of like to understand how all of this works, almost like a rankings consultation as I understand it. And it works because they know what levers you have to pull to make movement inside this. And they also know which levers you could pull and it doesn't have any, difference-making ability whatsoever. I don't know that side of the business at all. I just, hear certain things about it, and I find it very interesting that it exists and that some schools eat that up and other schools are like, no.
Yeah.
And who knows what that, role that's playing.
Looking at you, Harvard, might be time to phone a friend.
You'd think so. You think you're Harvard, you don't need any help, but Harvard's been under a lot of fire recently, so maybe they do.
Good.
Anyway, let's get...
Yeah, but we don't do that specifically, but it is kind of fun to sit on the sidelines and watch.
Yeah, it sure is. My favorite part of this whole thing is not really talking about the movement or even the methodology. It's actually the winners and losers. Who came out better in these rankings? Who came out worse in these rankings? Okay. So let's talk about a couple of schools here that I think are clear winners. UCLA and Vanderbilt.
Yeah.
This one's pretty easy. UCLA is now solidly crept in past Georgetown of all schools, certainly past Cornell, and they're sitting at the 12th position. Looking good there for UCLA because they've, even in their own state, they've always been behind Berkeley. Berkeley's been up as high as like 6, I think, before. Berkeley's always considered like, a little bit academically better, I think, and a more national reputation. And this is being challenged by that. Vanderbilt, as we saw, has leapt into, the T14 and now has that position. So these two are clear winners.
Mm-hmm.
Got any losers for me, John?
Well, I mean, one that we've been kind of harping on just because look, it's easy to punch up, right? Harvard is punching up. You can always make fun of Harvard because they're Harvard. They've got to be disappointed, man. They've been on a steady slide out of the top 2, 3. Now they're tied 6th with Duke. No offense. That's got to sting.
No
Harvard, I
taking
think.
for Duke.
Okay. Harvard comes
Duke has risen over the years, so for them to be solidly, say, in the top 8, I think is a big win.
Yeah, there you go. If only they could make free throws. And then, of course, I think the other loser, that one. Sorry, but not a cheap shot. The other loser in this group, I think, that we've seen is Cornell. Cornell's well established in the top 14, and where do they go? Out of it. They dropped 4 this year. Now they're 18th. Now, granted, they were always on the cusp, but to drop to 18th out of 14, oof, that hurts.
I'd have to go back and look at the records, but I know last year Cornell was in the T14.
They were 14th last year. They might have been tied.
They were 13 the year prior, at least, a ways before. I think this may be the first time they're ever out of the top 14. I'd have to go look at the historical records, but I think that may be the case. And if they did drop out, it was like 5 or 6 years ago.
I want to say this too. The fact that you and I have such a good and distinctive memory about this suggests a lot more about how important it is to know and just more about our memory. I don't really care where Cornell is in these rankings. It's a good school. Duke leapfrogging all the way up to 6th. I mean, it's been a steady, more gradual progression. Duke's a great school, whether they're 6th or 10th or 15th.
They were 4th last year, so they've dropped down.
Okay, that's true. Yeah, Harvard too. Well, they kind of dropped down. They dropped down 1 if you want to count the ties.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what it is. But
I guess now it's 6 and 7, so I'm wrong about that math.
6 and 6.
There is no 7?
Yeah, but this probably, if it's not the first time, this hasn't happened many times for Cornell to be outside the 14. So I would imagine there's some irritated people in Upper New York.
If they care, and I hope they don't care too much, but it's a great school. If that's the right school for you, go there, not because of what numbers attached to where they are in these rankings, which, as we've repeatedly expressed, are somewhat arbitrary, but because it suits the needs that you have or the desires you have from the school that you'd want to go to, or they give you the right kind of money.
Absolutely. So let's go on to some more winners here. And this is kind of like my, the big winner, the big loser. Who jumped the most? In this case, the biggest overall jump this year, 32 spots up to number 88. The University of Maine.
Into the double digits.
Yeah, I believe they're the Black Bears is the school mascot there. Interestingly enough, though, that 32 kind of like jump, spot jump is easily the largest. And last year you had 4 schools that had jumps of 30 or more, and one school jumped more than 40 spots. That didn't happen this year. The volatility of movement has been limited, and that is also true for the biggest loser. John, who was the biggest loser?
I think we probably have to give it to New Hampshire.
Well, I think we can give it to New Hampshire because statistically it's true.
Oh, I was just thinking about the state. You mean the school? They were also
New Hampshire, man. Have you noticed the Northeast is seeing Maine and New Hampshire? Wow, one's rising, the other's dropping.
Yeah,
it's a tough day for those
slammed in these things. Yeah, New Hampshire dropped 27 points this time. I talked about Maine just a second ago. Any of the double digits. New Hampshire dropped out of them. 27 points to number 125.
So out of the T100.
Yeah, they were right on the cusp. They were 98, and now they're 125. That's a pretty remarkable drop. And you wonder, in cases like that, in Maine as well, what happened? What actually changed? Because as we explained earlier with the algorithm or the metrics here, the formula for U.S. News hasn't changed. So something these schools did year over year. Yeah, it's got to be a bar passage rate, something.
A couple students slacked off, didn't pass the bar, and all of a sudden they're down a little bit. Interestingly enough, from a loser perspective, there were fewer large swings as well. Last year you had 5 schools with drops of 30 or more.
Yeah.
This year, no school dropped more than 30. So the volatility factor totally different in this year's rankings versus the prior year rankings.
Yeah, you and I had a field day with this last year because of how much volatility there was.
It was insane.
Yeah. This year, the biggest drop we saw is New Hampshire at 27, biggest gain, Maine 32. When you're seeing 40 plus last year, that was crazy.
That was crazy. Last year, there was a jump of 40 and a drop of 40. Obviously, different schools. But, that kind of situation is like, really? You got 40 spots better? No. So, John, that brings us actually to the last point on this winners losers list, and I'm going to call it a winner and a loser.
I'm going to let you take it, and I'm going to chime in, but I'm going to let you take it.
It's my favorite part. The winner and loser is U.S. News. First off, they win because we're sitting here talking about it.
They got us again.
We're flogging the rankings and kind of like going through it, but everyone talks about them, so I think it's in our purview to be able to do that, and our obligation as well. They lose because, first off, I think they suck. I hate these rankings. They're totally arbitrary. There's a million ties in here, which just makes it so unsatisfying and useless feeling. Like, why are there so many ties when you know that in the real world, first off, it's arbitrary whether or not one school is better or another. Then is Minnesota better than the University of Southern California or the reverse? There'll be people that make arguments on both sides. I don't know. They're 6 spots apart this year. Is that meaningful? I don't think so, and I really hate the arbitrary nature of this. So they win because we're talking about it. They lose because, well, they are who they are.
Yeah, it does feel a bit Montessori, doesn't it? Everybody gets a trophy. You guys, tie.
It's not just Montessori, man. That's like society.
Oh, fair enough, yeah.
Go down to any baseball field and watch the end of the season play out. Everybody's getting a trophy.
You can have 4 strikes. 5. Yeah, that bothers me on different levels. This, to me, and I think we've emphasized this enough, so I won't dwell on it, but to me, hopefully what people get out of this is it's a little entertaining to kind of watch some of the shifts, the ebb and flow. It's important that you start to think about the data that goes into this. That, to me, is really the biggest takeaway, is how would this matter to you in a way that should? Because it shouldn't be the number of where a school is. It should be the things that get quantified into it. And then most importantly, please don't take this too seriously. Because this is all very silly.
Yeah, somebody comes to me and I'm like, I really have a hard decision between 17 and 19.
Right.
19 gave me a full ride, but 17 is just, they're 2 spots better. I will throw you out of the room.
Dude, I get messages from people probably 2, 3, 4 times a month where they're like, in moments like this, where they're like, oh man, I went to a school that was 17 last year and now they're 22. Have I made a mistake? Should I start looking at transfers?
No, because next year they might be, 15.
Yeah.
You don't know.
These things won't haunt you. I promise. These don't follow you for the rest. It's not a bad penny. It's not going to follow you for the rest of your life. You'll be all right.
Yeah, and if you're actually in a position right now where you're trying to decide where to go to school, and you're looking at the money you're getting, you're looking at the school choices, you're looking at rankings, as everybody does. The blog that I answer all the questions on is called Scholarship versus Prestige: When to Take the Money and Run. And in the comment replies, people will set up scenarios like, I've got this and then this, and then I kind of like slowly over a series of posts responses really lay out a methodology for looking at the schools and making these types of decisions. In some cases I find it relatively obvious, and in a large number of other cases it's like I need to know more about the person before making that decision. So just something to reference if you're in that position.
And buckle up, because there are hundreds of comments in that thread, a significant percentage of which is you giving people help. I think you and I actually did an entire podcast episode.
We did.
Just stealing comments from that particular thread. Be like, let's talk more about this.
I think
the way you begin to break those things down very analytically is, I think it's not only helpful, but I think it's also revealing to the type of way that your mind is meant to work, not yours, but anyone's mind is meant to work. When they come to making these decisions, watch the way that Dave deconstructs the questions asked and the answers given, and try to replicate that as you ask and answer your own questions.
Yeah, the podcast that we did was really early on.
Yeah.
And it was also called Scholarship versus Prestige. So you can read the comments or you can listen to the podcast, because I think I began to lay out that methodology. It's not really a methodology. It's just a way of analyzing it and saying, what are the points that you should consider as you kind of go through this?
But it's a lot less nebulous, a lot less like alchemical, I think, than some people would try to make this, where they're just like, I don't know, I have Newt, chicken intro. Like this, there's an actual method to the madness of all of this. And I think the answers that you give in the comments of that particular blog post really do help to illustrate that and then make it tangible.
That was my goal. And on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it in the world. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave a comment or a rating as well. And if you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we hope you've enjoyed this podcast. We will talk to you soon. Stay safe out there.
you.